In the meantime, what I would say is that a lot of this journey is about growing patience around a lot of things. And I think if we all look at our lives, men and women, we know we're a very hurried human race, and that sometimes a lot of this journey is simply learning how to wait patiently.
Right.
And while we're doing that, figure out what I can do for myself. And in this case, he has plenty of things, plenty of community to develop, plenty of counseling he can engage in, books to read, and while he's waiting for that other part, he can be working on all of these things to show her that he's inwardly motivated, internally motivated to become a different person.
Welcome to the Faithful and True podcast. We're happy to be with you today with our usual host, Dr. Greg Miller.
It's good to be here.
Very good to see you. And once again, the director of Faithful and True, co-founder, Debbie Laaser. Debbie, how are you?
I'm great, thank you.
Happy to have you with us today. We've got a great subject that we want to discuss on today's show, and that is, Greg, I think you've confronted this issue before with the men that you counsel with, and that is, what do I do when my wife doesn't want to get the help and support that she needs on our healing journey?
Right. Yeah, in fact, it actually came from a guy who sent me an email a while back. We did a podcast on what can a wife do if the husband isn't willing to get help. And in this particular case, a guy reached out to me and said this basically wasn't his story, that he was fully engaged in recovery. He was getting the help that he needed. And a couple of years into recovery, his wife still wasn't open to getting the help that she needed, and it felt like they were starting to get stuck in their relationship.
Sure.
So I thought Deb would be the perfect person to have this conversation with because of all the years of experience and just the recognition that we often teach that it is a journey for both of them and timing is important. So, what's the first response to helping a man who is in a situation where his wife isn't open at this point to getting help?
Mm-hmm. Well, as I've been thinking about this question, what comes to me first is that when he talks with his wife, it comes from an invitational place. We can get a little stuck with, hey, you need to go here as well, or you need help as much as I do. But I think the invitational place just might come from a little bit of his own story even, that I realized when I was all alone and didn't have much support, how, my behavior just got worse and worse, and it just felt horrible to not have people that I could talk with. And I would think that as much hurt as I've created for you from this, that you would benefit too by having more people in your life. And I just want to encourage you to get help, go to a workshop at Faithful and True, or at least, have a counselor or a small group or whatever. Mm-hmm. So that's more of the invitational place.
Right.
And probably, I don't know that I was on the podcast with the other way around, but that's what I would often recommend for wives to say to their husbands too, so that we're not trying to control their life. We want them to know that we sincerely want them to get support. And that's what I think the beginning of this journey is all about, not being alone.
And I'm not familiar with this particular person. It was just someone that reached out. Mm-hmm. But one of the things I would also say, and you mentioned to this, it's the importance of the husband is fully owning his contribution to the chaos. Mm-hmm. I know that we could be tempted early on to want our wives to get help and to look at their stuff. And the reality is, we begin with our own ownership. And I would say that, the first thing I would say to a man who might present this is to make sure that you are in very clear and honest ways owning your contribution to the chaos from your addiction. We often say that the husband is completely responsible for the addiction. And my guess is, if the wife doesn't have confidence in that, there is going to be some reluctance to engage the journey at all, because that's not going to create that invitation that maybe you just talked about.
Right. And we wouldn't know, and maybe he doesn't even know who she's talked with so far, or knows even a little bit about the story, and that she's been blamed. And it's true, I think, back in the 80s or so, when Mark and I first began the recovery ourselves, it was looked at as wives had plenty of things to look at, and there was this uncomfortableness about feeling, even though you were told you didn't cause this, and it's like, why are you so invested in me looking at myself?
Right.
And so it can be very confusing for her to not trust that that's not why people want her to get help, that it's about support and so forth. So I think in return for that, if she's not willing or wanting to do that, we could talk about this in just a few minutes, there are probably some good reasons for that. I'd like to talk more about that. But in the meantime, what I would say is that a lot of this journey is about growing patience around a lot of things. And I think if we all look at our lives, men and women, we know we're a very hurried human race, and that sometimes a lot of this journey is simply learning how to wait patiently.
Right.
And while we're doing that, figure out what I can do for myself. And in this case, he has plenty of things, plenty of community to develop, plenty of counseling he can engage in, books to read. And while he's waiting for that other part, he can be working on all of these things to show her that he's inwardly motivated, internally motivated to become a different person.
I once heard a sermon on active patience, and the woman that was preaching just did a great job of talking about how many times we see patience as just being passive. You're just waiting for something. But in this case, it's very much what you're saying is, while I'm being patient to see what my spouse may or may not do, there's so much that I can do for my own recovery. And the work that I can do to create safety, to contribute to the dynamic in our relationship that I can, and allowing that time, if needed, to pass without it just being I'm standing in the corner with my arms crossed waiting for her to do something, but I'm allowing myself to be engaged in my own journey.
And even the work of why is it so important that she join me right now? And maybe it's kind of early on. Some men, I think, are more comfortable in a couple's journey through many things here than they are working on themselves. Well, that would be a great therapeutic issue. What are your beliefs about her if she chooses not to join you in this? And there would be all kinds of answers to that. Well, we'll never grow as a couple, or our marriage is dead, or whatever. So there's work on, no matter what comes of his response, is doing, and again, good work for him. We know that typically the men that come here struggling with an addiction also have a lot of abandonment issues, and so it's understandable why there would be an urgency for a spouse to engage. And so again, that might be a good time to talk about that part and learn about that pain and be able to work through some of the trauma of the old abandonment issues in his life.
Well, I also think that, kind of like what you're saying, things will be exposed in the waiting. And for a lot of men, consciously and unconsciously, they are doing their recovery because they are wanting some sort of response from their spouse. That they're wanting her to commit to stay, or they're wanting her to go after her own stuff. And so really this allows a man to evaluate, what are my motives for my own recovery? Will I still be committed to this even if I don't see my wife being open or being willing to engage it? Maybe she sees this as only my issue, that I have to take care of everything in the relationship, but whatever, it allows me to see myself more clearly if I take this opportunity.
Surely you've shared your story early on with this man.
Well, and again, this isn't necessarily somebody that I work with.
No.
Now, he did come to the workshop, so he may have heard some of that early on. But that idea that for Beth and I, our separation early on was very complete, and I was doing my own work, not even aware that Beth was observing. And what's interesting, I think that does get to this idea of we can't fully know where another person is. And so even though from this man's perspective, his wife may seem very passive, there may be things that she's doing that she's not communicating. And one of them may be observing him and his recovery to see what is happening there, which was very much my story. I found out after Beth and I reconciled and I moved back home that even though it seemed as if she was completely disinterested in me and my journey, my recovery, that she was observing from a distance, and that was telling her something about the work that I was doing.
Everything is therapeutic, you know, as I say. And it's true, you know, just in terms of how many times does he ask her to get involved, and does she feel like that's pressure, or is she feeling possessed by his needs and she can't get away from them? I mean, there's just all kinds of things.
Right.
I would love to look at, though, some of the reasons why she might not be engaging. So I have several, but you can jump in.
Okay.
I'm sure you know some too. Well, one of them that I hear sometimes is that I'm waiting for him to engage in enough of his own work first. And I think that's a legitimate reason, in that maybe she's been trying to engage him in, you know, marriage work or going to counseling or whatever for a long time, and he hasn't been interested. And now he wants to because he's had a great awakening, which is great if that happens. And you can see her reluctance to just jump in. You know, it's like, I think I'll stay back for a while and make sure you're really committed to this work that you say you want to be.
Right.
So I think that's one reason I see a fair amount. I think another one can be money. I believe wives worry more about that in many cases than maybe their husbands do. Do you think that's the truth?
I think when it comes to recovery, that may be true.
Okay.
That the perception is there is this amount of money that we have for recovery. And maybe it's a legitimate amount that they came up from budgeting, or maybe it's just an unconscious amount that they determine is a legitimate amount. But what can easily happen is the belief is whatever resources we have needs to go towards him. And on the surface, that's logical, because if he doesn't engage recovery, if he doesn't get well, if he doesn't get free from the addiction, then this chaos is just going to continue. So on some level, it does make sense. The challenge of that, though, is this image that we talk about where it's like the couple was in a car accident, the husband was driving, he was completely responsible for the accident, he's the one that caused it, but the reality is she was in the car and she was injured. So it also makes sense some of those resources goes towards her getting the help that she needs from, you know, for healing from the accident. And so if I see my husband as the one completely responsible, or the one that is going to determine our future, then it does make sense on some level that I think he should be the one that gets all the resources.
And as I mentioned a few minutes ago, I think there can be a fear that she will be blamed when she starts getting help. And all kinds of things will be pointed out about what she didn't do well and whatever. And when you're reeling from the discovery of all this new information, that's kind of the last thing you want to hear. I remember when Mark went to treatment, thankfully back then, many years ago, over 35, he had the opportunity to go to inpatient treatment. And there was a family week during that, in which case I was invited to go. And I tell you, not having ever been in counseling, and no, that's not true. I was one time in a counseling session, and that therapist recommended that Mark and I learn how to play more together because we had 3 small children. That clearly didn't work. But anyway, that was my own experience. And so thinking about going with all these professional people and talking about who knows what, I really wasn't sure I would even survive. I was terrified. But I drove these 5 hours into Minnesota. We lived in Iowa at the time. I was so scared I didn't even stop at all. I drove straight there. And so I think there's a lot of fear for many women about engaging in this, not knowing how they'll be treated. And I wish I could say that there are so many people who are understanding of addiction and this model, especially sex addiction, which is so personal, that they would never think to blame a wife for their husband's addiction. And that just is not the case yet.
Right.
It's getting better, but it's not the case.
Well, and I think what you're saying is so significant. It's that the early help that somebody gets determines how they interpret or perceive help. And like you said, those first comments, those first reactions, especially when we're reaching out for help and it's not helpful, in fact it's hurtful, it makes perfect sense that somebody doesn't want to try that again. Or maybe it has nothing to do with this particular situation, but maybe previously. Like you said, there was a counseling experience that did not go well, or they were blamed for something early on. And so therefore they were given messages about counseling. So all of those can play into how I perceive the recovery experience and my willingness to be a part of it. And maybe there are some conversations that she had that he was not aware of that were difficult or painful. But I think another thing can be just research that people do on their own can lead them to believe that maybe there's no hope, or they were given some misinformation, and that now is something that they're taking into account as they determine how they want to move forward.
Yeah. And her job is simply to figure out how to tolerate slipping and sliding around for the rest of your life. There's still way too much of that information out on the internet. And there are wives, I think, who are trying to be a good Christian or follow, their spiritual teachings that believe they don't have a choice anyway. They have to stay and figure out how to make the best of it. So there can be many reasons why they don't come. I just want to say, even as we're talking about this, Greg, my heart starts to get really sad because I think about myself, and if Mark hadn't gone to inpatient treatment and we hadn't, both of us, been directed to get help, I could have easily been one of those women, I wanted Mark to get the help he needed. He was the problem after all. We were broke. We didn't have much money to spend on any of this. I had 3 little kids. How in the world could I get out? Everything was in person at that time, of course. I had a lot of reasons, and I was afraid of people really knowing who I was because they would blame me. And so my heart breaks because I know where a lot of the women may be on this, and I just want to say, if you reach out to any of us here, that is not how you will be received. We just want to hold you, hug you, hear your pain, and help you know that there's healing whether you stay or you don't, and that we want to help you become everything you can be and the person God called you to be, even through hard, difficult, traumatic situations. Well,
and I think that's part of I just said this in a previous podcast, that's part of the beauty of Faithful and True, is that the women who are on staff here have gone through this. And there is that point of identification, one of the things that Beth and I talk about in my story, it was very public. Everybody in our community knew about it. It was just common knowledge as far as we knew. And we've often had conversations about who would we have told if that wasn't taken away from us. And, if somebody is hesitant to tell someone, I want them to understand, I get it. I'm not sure I would have told anybody. It was just that option was taken away from me. And so that recognition, and I think that's one of the things that creates that sense of compassion, is when we are able to remember those early days and some of the choices that we made that were helpful or not helpful, some of the choices that were taken away from us. And it's that idea of judgment. I think part of what is true here at Faithful and True is probably not perfectly, but we do our best not to judge others, knowing that if we had lived their life and experienced what they've experienced, we might be making the very same choices that they made. And so if there is someone that finds themselves resistant, whether you're a husband or the wife, we understand resistance. I know what it is not to go. I often tell people, part of the system when I was in recovery was you paid for your group experience whether you went or not. And there were many times on a Tuesday night at 8 o'clock I got in my car and drove the hour to my group, not because I wanted to be there, but because I knew I was paying for it, whether I was there or not. And I was going to get my money's worth, And I think sometimes we need to just be reminded that there is a part of us that is resistant to this because it is difficult, it is painful. And we're inviting people to step into that pain, and that's not always a welcomed invitation.
Well, while you've been talking, I've thought of 3 more reasons why women might not engage. So sometimes my brain just needs a little break. One of those is, and I heard this recently, that a woman was afraid to start talking about this story because she was trying to protect her husband's reputation. It was a very honorable thing, he had a public position. She didn't want to add to any of that pain by having any of it get out. And I think in some ways I was like that too. Mark was in a lot of public things, and we didn't have that option either because it became very public very fast. Now I have to think, I wish I had paper notes.
Well, what that also shows is that you maintained your love for him.
Yes, I
You know,
think that
it
does.
just, I mean,
Yeah.
for you to be so concerned about that, showed that despite the hurt and the pain of all of that, that you still love him to the degree that you were worried about how it would affect him.
Yeah. The flip side of that could be, I was also worried about who would take care of us
Mhm.
since he was the primary breadwinner. That
Yeah.
could be another reason
Sure,
why
right,
you don't want to.
sure.
So there can be many, but I like your spin on that. For me, that's somewhat.
I was just trying to buy enough time for you to start
Thank
thinking.
you. You know me well now.
Yeah.
Okay, so another one came. Some women are told by their husbands they cannot tell their story to anyone. So they're silenced by their spouses. And that makes it particularly difficult because we all do need places to talk. Ideally, when we find safe places to talk, then we don't start telling the wrong people just because it's got to get out. But I think in us, there's such a desire to live in truth and not hide with this stuff, even though we have a lot of reasons why we do, that when you're also told not to speak, that doesn't help. So, you know, for the husbands who are working through this recovery, please make sure that you're not indicating to your wife that she can't talk about this to
Right.
people. That's it.
Well, and part of it may be subtle, where I'm not clearly saying don't tell anybody, but I have all of these conditions of who you can tell or what you can
Right.
tell, or don't say this, and so at some point, if I have too many limitations on who you can tell or what you can tell, at some point it becomes easier and maybe less stress producing just not to tell anybody.
Mm-hmm.
I think another reason is a fear of losing whatever it is that remains after the information has been shared. That for a lot of couples, they have a good life, they have jobs, they have family, they have connections. And there is this fear to really go after this and tell more people or get help or support or join communities. Whatever good that was left, their fear is they're going to lose that too.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's kind of like just keeping what is available and not expecting more, but not hoping to lose more, but just to be able to maintain what you have.
Mm-hmm. And I think for many of us wives, there is a shame factor that shows up also, even though it wasn't our behavior, but the fact that maybe inside we are somewhat blaming ourselves and we're believing that we're part of the problem, even though we're told we're not part of the problem. But it's really hard to live with not believing that there was something you didn't do enough of, or you didn't show up with enough something. Sex, love, nurturing, affirming, whatever it is that you determine you're not enough of. And so that shame can really shut us down as
Right.
well. And so it could be that. And there was another one, and I'm sorry, I can't think.
Well, and
Unless
maybe it'll
somebody
come
buys
back. That's the
it.
way it works.
Let me come up with some.
It's out there somewhere.
Well, you know what's
I know.
one of the things that I would also say is, and I do work with some men who have been on the journey for 4 or 5 years, and the wife really hasn't gotten any support. And, it at some point does begin to limit their movement forward as a couple. And it moves beyond just about him, but, either some aspect of her own story. I know in the cases that I'm thinking of, what's true is the wife has significant pain that predates the husband. And maybe intuitively knowing to really look at what's happened in our relationship may move me to start looking at some of those things that somewhere along the way I made a commitment never to address or never to look at. And I do think that sometimes I often say there's a reason we don't go into the scary basement. It's not because we think it's empty, it's because of what we suspect may be there. And I think that just like for men, that their lives explode, their addiction is exposed, and so they start to dig deeper into their story, and then there's a part of them that is resistant to that because of what they know. There are some things that they suspect, but I think the same thing can be true for wives. For the man, he might have been pushed to look at his story, but for the wife, she may not have that same, a push because she's not the one struggling with addiction. So she has the same resistance, but she doesn't have the same motivation. And that may be part of the reason, even years into the journey, she may be hesitant to go a little bit deeper.
So I'll just share a quick story that I know Mark used to share at the women's workshops when he would speak to them. And that was he was asked, how was the best, how can I say this grammatically correct? What was the best thing Debbie did for you to help you?
Mhm.
And he said the best thing was that she sought help herself.
Mm-hmm.
And, given all the years we were in recovery and worked with people and taught and counseled ourselves, I love that was his answer. And again, it wasn't because he ever blamed me or felt like I needed to change a bunch of things about myself. And yet, as I worked on myself and he worked on himself, it gave us both the opportunity to grow the relationship, because it is my belief we can grow when one person changes, and only so much.
Mm-hmm.
And if we really want to go for that transformative journey that I know we can be on post-traumatic experience, it does take both of us self-exploration to understand who we are and what we bring to the relationship. And so I think that's why we were able to have some magnificent years. It doesn't mean everything is beautiful all the time, and yet the ability to talk about anything and usually understand each other and make better decisions together as a couple, as parents, was so much better when we were both working on things. Mm-hmm.
One other note that I would say, going back to the car analogy, so this couple is in a car accident. The husband starts to get help, because he was injured in the accident and he was responsible for the accident. And it is painful to see the person that you've hurt not getting the help that they need. Mm-hmm. And as husbands, you may not always present yourself as the kindest way or the most patient person. And what may also be true, that underneath some of that chaos is just a genuine love for your wife, for her to get the help that she needs to heal from the pain that you have caused.
Yeah.
And even in that context, we just have to be patient, hoping and waiting for that person to get the help that they need.
Mm-hmm. And maybe he could even own that. Again,
Yeah.
We're talking about what are some things he could own that, maybe, honey, some of this is almost selfish, because knowing how much I hurt you, I can hardly stand to know you're not getting enough help.
Mm-hmm.
That would be
Right.
a wonderful thing to say. And I just want to end, because I know we have like 2 seconds.
Thank you very much.
That be practical, guys. Figure out what she could really use. Does she need money? Make sure she knows that that's the case. Does she need help with the kids so she can get out and make some appointments? Jump in and help her solve those problems. Assure her that she did not cause this, and if she ends up anywhere talking to anybody that blames her, run fast, because he knows that's not the truth. Be practical about what you're saying, not just that I want you to get help so we can do better as a couple.
Right.
Okay.
I know we're out of time, one quick thing. And support your wife in whatever she is doing that she thinks is helpful.
Yeah.
So if she wants to go on a girls' weekend because she just needs some time away, or she just needs some space, or whatever it may be, you may not see it directly as contributing to her own recovery, but if that's what she feels like she needs right now, support that, because that may be the path to ultimately what may be directly supporting her in her recovery.
Yes, well said.
Thank you so much for joining us today, Debbie and Greg. As we've been, the past couple of podcasts, we have been telling you about the opportunity that we have created. We've recently been getting a lot of requests on how can I financially support people who need the direction and the support that Faithful and True has to offer through our 3-day intensive workshops and through the counseling that we provide here. With that in mind, we created a nonprofit organization called the Laaser Legacy Foundation. We will put a link on this podcast that will bring you right to laserlegacy.com, and you can provide whatever level of support that you'd like to provide for someone who needs the help, who wants the help, but finances are just the big struggle for them. So until then, we'd also like to invite you to visit our website, faithfulandtrue.com, where you'll find all the information and online registration for our 3-day workshops for the men's, the women's, and for our couples journey workshops. Until we join you again next week, we hope that this coming week will be a week for you that's filled with many blessings and with great vision.